Ivy and Dan has been instrumental with the Collapse the Core groups in Rhode Island. Those are the town-specific websites. And if your town isn't listed, we have a sheet we're going to give you at the end. If your town isn't listed, think about starting one, okay? I want to thank Patricia Hinks and Pam Stoney for their awesome posters, okay? Can you tell they're teachers? Because they're former teachers, and those are awesome posters. Thank you so much. Like I said, we have a sheet we're going to give you at the end. Please don't forget to take one of those. I'd like to get on to our main event now. This is Dr. Peg Luksik. And Peg Luksik is a Pennsylvania teacher with over 35 years of experience in both special education and elementary education. She has taught at every level, from preschool to college, in regular classrooms, resource centers, self-contained special education classes, and in alternate education settings. She has trained teachers in curriculum and classroom management, written and evaluated curricula, authored several books on education issues, and hosted a nationally syndicated television program dealing with education in America. She founded a program to assist low-income single mothers complete their education, which was recognized by President Reagan and named as National Point of Light by President George Bush. Dr. Luksik served as an advisor to President Reagan's Commission on the Family and worked for the U.S. Department of Education, where her task was to review and evaluate education reform initiatives. Peg is the mother of 6 and grandmother of 1. So will you please give a warm welcome to Dr. Peg Luksik.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I did come from Pennsylvania. I was in Boston this morning speaking at a big rally on the Commons, so this is my rally outfit. I thought it'd be, red, white. I didn't have blue pants, so it's as close as I could get. The screen is more important than I am. I'm prettier, but that's more important, so please look at the screen. We're going to be looking at original documents tonight. I understand that we're going to also be talking about the testing, because I know the PARCC test is an area of a great concern in this community. So we're going to get started. I'm going to be feeding you through a fire hose, and what happens when I give these presentations, people say, I understood it while you said it. And then I went home and went, what did she say? I don't remember all of it. So to help you, I did 2 different CDs. When you look at them, they fit in your computer. You are seeing the documents and hearing my voice, but you're not seeing me. So that you have the documents on your own screen. That means you can print them, you can stop and look at them, you can read them for yourself. There are 2 different ones. The first one is called invalid and unreliable. Valid and reliable are not just words. When we're doing testing, they actually mean something, and they mean very specific things. So what I did was I took these new Common Core tests and I put them against the definitions of valid and reliable and showed you with research how they don't match pretty much anywhere. So if you're interested in the testing and in being able to talk about it, invalid and unreliable is what you want to look at. The other one is called Should Our Children Be Standardized? This is a system that says that by government fiat, every child will learn at the government's rate on the government's schedule. What happens in classrooms when you do that? There's actual research about that and how it affects the education of our children and what happens to our children and to our teachers when we try to force this system upon them. This one also includes information on the new Advanced Placement United States history standards that you may have heard about from the College Board. This is the new American history course that's being taught to our seniors that teaches the founding of this country without mentioning people like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, and teaches World War II without mentioning Dwight Eisenhower, D-Day, Adolf Hitler, or the Holocaust. So if you want to know what's happening in the new U.S. history standards, this would be the one for you. They're available on the side. We ask for a donation of $10 for each, and then I just roll that around to make more. It's like a circle for me. So they're available at the end, and you can pick them up on your way out if you would like to. Okay, you've already heard about me. This is a very long story, but we're not going to be here all night, so we're going to start in 1989. In 1989, President George Bush the Elder had an education summit with the National Governors Association. At the time, it was chaired by a man named William Clinton. The result of that summit was legislation. First, President Bush, it was called America 2000, and then with President Clinton, it was called Goals 2000. And Goals 2000 broke local control and said that there had to be national education goals and that the states had to set standards for their children. When you hear that this is state-led, it's never been state-led. It's been the federal government from the very beginning, all the way back in the early 90s, forcing the states to set standards for their children. Now, in the 90s, the mantra was not Common Core, it was called outcome-based education, and it created a ruckus all over the country. I know, I was one of the leading national opponents then, too. And folks stood up and fought back. And so Goals 2000 had no teeth because there was such a pushback from parents and teachers and community members to say we don't want the federal government directing education, that while the states had to set the standards, there was no teeth involved in it down to the local school level. That changed in 2001 with the passage of No Child Left Behind. The federal government has no constitutional role in education. If you read the U.S. Constitution, you won't see the word education anywhere, because our founders actually didn't want the federal government involved. As a matter of fact, James Madison, considered the father of the Constitution, actually wrote about that Congress should never be able to dictate or control the education of the children of America. So how did the federal government get involved? They started making money available to the states. The big influx of money happened in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson was in office as part of the War on Poverty. It was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. That made billions of dollars available to the states, and the states were told, well, here's the money, but you don't have to take it. But if you volunteer to take it, then you're volunteering for all of the requirements that go with the money. So since the states were technically volunteering, it got around the constitutional prohibition. Now, when the federal government makes money available, it's called an allocation, and they make this much money available for this much time. When the time ends, either the program goes away because the money runs out, or the federal government does what's called a reauthorization. They say, we're going to allocate the money again. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been reauthorized multiple times. The 2001 reauthorization of that 1965 law was called No Child Left Behind. So No Child Left Behind is actually a continuation of the 1965 law. What did No Child Left Behind say? And this was the centerpiece of President Bush the Jr.'s education plan. So we had Bush the elder, and then we had President Clinton, and now we have Bush the younger. So you can see RDR, and we're going to get to President Obama. So this is not a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. In fact, the state of Oklahoma, which is very Republican, just passed legislation to get rid of the Common Core state standards. And in the state of Washington, which is very Democrat, the Democrat State Committee unanimously voted to tell the state to get rid of the Common Core state standards. So you have a very red state and a very blue state in agreement. This is not an issue that is tied to party lines. It's one that crosses them. So what did No Child Left Behind say? It said all the states had to set content standards and achievement standards. Now, they'd already been doing that because Goals 2000 made it. No Child Left Behind just continued it. What's the difference between a content standard and an achievement standard? Why did they list both? A content standard says this is what teachers are going to teach. An achievement standard says this is what children are required to learn. So it was, for the very first time, a mandate from the federal government to the individual child, saying this is what the child must do. Now, if we move this to healthcare, the parallel would be a content standard. Every single doctor who sees a patient with diabetes must prescribe this much insulin to every patient with diabetes. Well, we would never do that, would we? An achievement standard. Everybody in this room has to have a blood pressure of 180 over 110. Do we do that? Well, no, wouldn't that be ridiculous? But see, your ability to learn is as unique as your blood pressure. So what this did then was force the states into doing something that was as impossible as mandating universal blood pressure. The standards were applicable to all of the public school students. They were in math, reading, and eventually science. The standards had to be rigorous, and we will look at how rigorous is actually defined. There were levels of achievement. Advanced was what you think. Proficient was passing. That was good enough. Basic would be a C minus. You didn't fail, but you don't really know how to do it either. The states were given targets. Every year you have to get closer to every child getting to all the standards. So this year, 25% of your kids have to do it, and next year, 30%, and the next year, 35%. Those targets were the adequate yearly progress. So when you do this debate, you hear about AYP. AYP was federally mandated targets that the state, and then within the state, each of the districts were handed, saying you have to get this close, you have to get this close, you have to get this close. How did they show that they did it? The states were required to put together a plan and then to develop assessments, state assessments, and the assessment was what the state used to prove that the children were proficient, that they were moving toward these targets. And the legislation further mandated that 12 years after the law was passed in the 2001-2002 school year, so 12 years later would be 2013-14, 100% of the children, all the students, were going to be proficient. But the states could define proficient wherever they wanted. But the federal government was mandating that 100% of the kids had to be proficient. So what did the states do? Let me show you. Stand up. Wiggle around up there, exercise good for you. Okay, this is vocal performance. When you can meet the standard, you can sit down, but you cannot sit down until you meet the standard. Are you ready? Luciano Pavarotti. Anybody who can sing like Pavarotti, considered one of the greatest tenors of the 20th century, can sit down. Soloist with the New York Met.
Right.
Chorus, congratulations. Chorus member with the New York Met. Soloist with a regional symphony. Chorus member with a regional symphony. Soloist with a church choir. This is a very unmusical group, with the exception of one guy. Sings in the church choir. Sings in the shower and enjoys it. Can't carry a tune in a bucket. Can't find the bucket. I'm a state. I have to prove that 100% of the children are proficient, but I can set proficient wherever I want. Where am I going to put it? Well, where did you all sit down? At Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. What about the child for whom the standard should have been Pavarotti? I am a teacher in a classroom. In this system, I have to prove, or I'm punished, that all of my children met the standard. But I get no reward whatsoever for any child taking one step beyond the standard. The child for whom the standard should have been Pavarotti walked into that classroom able to sing in the shower and enjoy it. So they get ignored. Did education succeed or fail for that child? Well, it failed. But it was a silent failure because that kid could already pass the test. So they'll show up as passing. But education didn't do anything for them. And in fact, that's what the research shows. That in this system, the University of Connecticut did a study and showed that the kids at the top are so frustrated because there's a ceiling on what is taught. Because the teacher isn't rewarded in any way for anybody taking one step beyond the standard. So where does the teacher spend her time? She spends her time with the kids immediately above Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It, and with Can't Carry a Tune in a Bucket. But Mrs. Can't Find the Bucket back there, I'm ignoring her too. Because the teacher knows that they can't get to 100. So the teacher cuts their losses and gets as many kids as close as they can get. So the kids at the bottom get ignored as well. And in fact, that's what the research shows. Which is why after 20 years, the achievement gap hasn't changed at all. If anything, it's getting bigger instead of smaller. Because we've put the teachers in a position where they don't have a choice. Now, did anybody know this was coming? Yeah, they did. Actually, you heard I was an advisor to the Reagan administration, and so I was actually there in the 80s because I'm old. And President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, they had a really kind of interesting relationship, you know, two Irish gentlemen who were drinking buddies, even though they didn't agree politically. And they decided that they wanted to know what was the status of education in America. And so they put together, Congress actually built a commission that spent 18 months doing a study, and the results were a document called A Nation at Risk, very famous document that has been spoken about a lot in education circles. And A Nation at Risk said that this whole minimum competency idea, which was just starting to get legs in the early 80s, it's a mistake, because they said the minimum will become the maximum, and education for everyone will go down. And that was in 1983, they predicted that. So we have No Child Left Behind, that the states had to say 100% of the children were proficient, but you could set proficient wherever you wanted. So what did Rhode Island do? Well, this is right off of your state's website, and in grade 4, and here's the original, I just made it bigger, this was given in October of the 2013-2014 school year. So your grade 4 kids, you said in reading 70% of them were proficient, and I just made it bigger. So when they took the state test, your state defined proficiency at a place where 70% of the kids were passing, and parents got a piece of paper saying, congratulations, little Johnny is proficient. There actually is a national exam. Congress put together and authorized the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which has been in business since the mid-60s. Their test, the test that they give now, was actually validated in 1992. So, and they give it every other year to 4th grade, 8th grade, and in some states, 12th grade. So this is the 4th grade national assessment given in 2013. 4th grade reading. When those kids took the state test, 70% were proficient. When they took the national assessment, 38% were proficient. Well, either you can read at the 4th grade level, or you can't read at the 4th grade level. But your State Department of Education had been told, if all of the children aren't proficient, there's going to be punishments. The national assessment, they don't care. They're not tied financially or in any other way to the results of the test, so they just give the test and report the results. And they haven't changed the cut score, the definition of proficient, since the early 90s. So if you look at the chart at the top, this is, see this line right here? Anything on that side of the line is how the kids did in the national assessment. They were proficient or above on that side of the line, basic or failing on the other side of the line. Well, you can see your results really haven't changed at all. So we had Goals 2000, and then we had No Child Left Behind, and now we have Common Core, and we're not really seeing large changes in the result. And in fact, when they analyzed it, they talked about the score gap between the high-performing students. It hasn't changed since 1992. So this whole idea that creating standards and making teachers teach to the standards, and we're spending billions of dollars, we're not really seeing a change in the national assessment results in how the kids are doing or in the achievement gap. Well, let's look at 8th grade. In 8th grade, your state said 74% of the kids were proficient in the reading exam. When those same 8th graders took the national assessment, 36% were proficient. Well, that's like half. Not quite. This is a problem. In math, grade 4, 63% proficient on the state assessment. When they took the national assessment, 42. 8th grade, state assessment, 57. In the national assessment, 36. And again, if you look over here, the score gap between the high and lows hasn't changed since 1990. What happened? Why the big difference? Well, what the states did was they changed the cut scores. They said, we can manipulate the definition of proficient. That doesn't mean the kids were doing better. They didn't raise the achievement bar. They lowered the definition of success so that parents would see a high score. But that doesn't mean that they were actually learning what they were supposed to learn. Rhode Island was not alone. This chart is from the National Center for Education Statistics in 2008. The brown bar here, that's the level of achievement you would need to get the score proficient in the national assessment. The blue bar in the middle is what the national assessment calls basic, that's C- level. And anything below would be failing. The little red flags are where every state in this nation defined proficient on their state exam. Not one single state defined proficient at the place that the national assessment did. Only 8 states defined proficient at an achievement level that the national assessment would call basic. And fully 42 states defined proficient at a level that the national assessment would consider failure. Maryland was at least very upfront about it. Maryland's Department of Education said, we defined proficient at a level where every child could reach it. And it says it in those words. My kids went, Mom, why didn't you send us to school in Maryland? That would have been so much better. Most states are a little less open about it. So in Pennsylvania, where I live, I had to go digging. And in the Keystone exam, which is what we call our high school assessment, at the Algebra 1 level, there were 6 parts. In the first part, there were 9 points possible. If you got 3 of them, you passed. That's a 33%. I don't know any parent on the planet, if little Johnny came home with a 33, would say, congratulations, honey, you passed. We would be using other words in our house. The most you had to get was a 60. And in fact, when you look across the country, in most cases, 60 was the highest anybody had to get anywhere to be passing, if you could find the raw data at all. So what we have is manipulated scores. Well, what's the result of that? The result was, by the time they got to college, all these kids were failing, which is why our colleges began to report by 2010 that nearly 60% of our first-year college students needed remedial work in math and English before they could even start taking college courses. So if you have kids in college now, you know that when they start, they have to take that diagnostic test in math and in English before they can even think about going into a college-level course. Most of them, more than 60%, wind up having to take non-credit bearing remedial courses before they're even ready to start college-level classwork, which means they won't finish in 4 years. And if you're writing those checks, well, that's a little problematic. This year, the National Association for Adult Literacy, they have a bunch of branches, and they did an analysis talking about the average reading level of incoming college freshmen. It's 7th grade. Which means the colleges have had to adapt their reading lists for incoming freshmen, removing things like Dickens, Steinbeck, Chaucer, Hemingway, Dostoevsky, Victor Hugo, and replacing books that if you go into your local Barnes & Noble bookstore, if you go to that young adult section, those are the books that you'll find. But that means that they're not getting the concepts either in those classic literature books, because our kids can't read above the 7th grade level. But yet we're being told they're proficient. Into the gap stepped the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among others. And actually there's been articles in the Washington Post talking about how the architects of the Common Core State Standards actually went to Bill Gates and asked him to bankroll the process. This is one of the earlier grants that he gave. It was in 2008. He gave the grant to the James B. Hunt Institute. He gave them $2.2 million. The Hunt Institute's total income that year was $2.5 million. So they were very open to what the Gates Foundation had to say, since the Gates Foundation was more than 95% of their income. And the money was given them to promote the adoption of rigorous, there's that word again, internationally benchmarked education standards. In response, the Hunt Institute created a newsletter, this is the first edition, called Blueprint, and said they were partnering with these groups to explore the potential for a Common Core. And here's, as far as we know, where the word first surfaced. A Common Core of rigorous, internationally benchmarked education standards. The Gates Foundation continued to fund the Hunt Institute. The next grant was for $5.5 million so that they could help states that were seeking to rapidly implement the standards. So instead of stepping back in 2008 and 2009 and saying, you know, we've done this standards-based stuff since the early 90s, and 60% of our kids need remediation in college, maybe we shouldn't treat education like manufacturing. Maybe we shouldn't be looking to quality check children and make them all identical, all learning at the same level. Maybe there's something wrong with that. Maybe we should look again. That's not what happened. Instead, they doubled down on the system that they all say failed and centralized control of the standards. And then the Gates Foundation gave money to move as quickly as possible, which is why people feel like what happened? Where did this come from? It's like it was railroaded. Well, that was on purpose. That was on purpose. The money was given to make it happen that way. The Hunt Institute then continued its newsletters. This is from the second edition. And they said all of these organizations have expressed support for these standards. And so we're going to be responding to their call. So I looked up how much money those organizations got from the Gates Foundation. 25 million, 10 million, 11 million, 37 million, 24 million, 11 million, 4 million, 4 million, and 11 million. That's a lot of money. And just in that 5-year time period. So it was a marketing circle. The Gates Foundation gave money to the Hunt Institute to start the call for Common Core standards. Then the Gates Foundation gave money to all of these organizations to say, we want Common Core standards. And then they gave more money to the Hunt Institute to answer that call. So Gates money funded every step of the way. Did Bill Gates know something we don't know? No. This is from the Washington Post. He was interviewed about this. Actually, he spoke at Harvard, and he was asked about it, and he said, well, we don't really know if this will work for about a decade. Mr. Gates sends his children to a school that does not do Common Core. So it's okay to use your children as guinea pigs, but he protected his. So why did he do it? This is also, the Daily Caller is an online service, and then they pulled an article from the Washington Post as well, talking about Microsoft. Well, Common Core, all these tests are online, they're all computerized, and so the Gates Foundation actually, on their website, this was in April of 2014, had a webpage called Tech Essentials for Teaching Success. And they said, these schools, well, they can't use Windows XP because it's going to have an end of service. So they have to upgrade their Windows. And they're going to need new professionals, they're going to need all this support, they're going to need all of the new screens and the new processors, and of course, Macs won't be supported. They'll also have to have new internet connections and all of the hardware, like all the headphones, to do this. So Mr. Gates spent hundreds of millions, but he is going to rake in billions. And when the reporter from the Washington Post said, yeah, I'm doing the math here, he was shocked that anyone would even intimate that money was a consideration in his mind. Which might be easier to believe if he didn't remove his children from the reach of Common Core. Achieve has become one of the leaders, and they said that they're going to move these college and career readiness into a national agenda, and that they did it at the direction of 48 states. That's a lie. Not one single state legislature appropriated one single penny to Achieve for the purpose of developing education standards that would be mandatory for the children of that state. Not one single state legislature passed one single piece of legislation authorizing Achieve to develop standards that would be mandatory for the children of that state. This was not done at the direction of the states. This was fed to them. After the standards were written and while they were developed, and then afterward, Achieve went to the states and said, if you sign this memorandum, you'll be able to get federal money. But you have to sign on to get it, because that was one of the requirements of the Race to the Top grant. While the standards were being written, people started to say, well, who's writing them? And originally, no one wanted to tell anybody any information. But eventually, because of the outcry, this is the press release from the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. They're one of the copyright owners of the standards. I just made the typing bigger so you could see it. They started with a work group. The work group had 29 people. They were content experts from Achieve, the ACT, and the College Board. None of them were active K through 12 classroom teachers. None of them were freshman level college professors. If you wanted to know what does it take to succeed as a freshman in college, don't you think you'd ask somebody who's teaching college freshmen? But they did not. The architect of the Common Core state standards was a man named David Coleman. Mr. Coleman actually did apply for a teaching job in the New York City public school system, and they declined to hire him. So a man who couldn't get a job teaching is driving education in America. The work group's deliberations were confidential. That means secret. We don't know who chose the members of the work group. We don't know why they were chosen. We don't have any minutes of any of their meetings. We don't know why they picked the standards they picked. We don't know why they chose them. We don't know who was responsible for what.